in support of Shakespeare studies at Saddleback. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to gather for an amazing presentation, followed by a conversation and lunch outside. We are very grateful for the support of the English Department and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, our Dean, Christina Hinkle, and our Assistant Dean, Jessica Caven, and particularly Noelle, Carrie Ann, and Angel, who worked so diligently to make this program happen. Thank you to Matt Brodette for the audio-visual support and creating a live stream of this program. Welcome to our live stream guests as well, viewing from all over the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zamenek. It is truly a personal joy to introduce our esteemed speaker today. I have had the great honor of knowing Professor Lupton for 15 years now as my, as my PhD advisor and my greatest mentor in Shakespeare and in life. Julia Reinhard Lupton is a distinguished professor of English at the University of California, Irvine. She's co-director of the UCI New Swan Shakespeare Center and interim director of the UC Humanities Institute. She has contributed to the founding of a number of very important initiatives at UCI, including Humanities Out There, Humanities Common, and Illumination, the Chancellor's Arts and Culture Initiative.
Julia Lupton is the author of several books on Shakespeare, including Citizen Saints, Shakespeare and Political Theology, Thinking with Shakespeare, Essays on Politics and Life, and Shakespeare Dwelling, Designs for the Theater of Life. Her awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship and an ACLS Fellowship. Her current book project, Shakespeare's Virtues, explores the many capacities developed by Shakespeare's plays, including hope, courage, trust, and respect. Julia has a PhD in Renaissance Studies from Yale University, and she has taught at UCI since 1989.
Following our talk here, there'll be opportunities for questions and some conversation before we head out for lunch. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Lupton to Saddleback for her talk today, Alike in Dignity, Seeking Virtues and Values in Romeo and Juliet. Thank you, Professor Lupton.
Well, thank you, both of you, for that beautiful introduction. And it's really nice to be here. Your campus is gorgeous, and of course the weather is great. So I'm looking forward to lunch outside and getting to know all of you a little bit better. As Professor Kaufman mentioned, I am writing a book. I have been for a while on Shakespeare and virtue. And this has already seen the light as a handbook published a couple of years ago by I think Cambridge University Press, and Professor Kaufman has a wonderful article in this volume. So she is a fellow traveler, a collaborator, a colleague, and a friend, as well as a former student. And she's certainly an inspiration to me and to all who know her. So I'm going to be talking today about three virtues in Romeo and Juliet: love, dignity, and hospitality. And dignity is kind of the turning point between those two concepts. Dignity may seem like an unlikely entry point for Romeo and Juliet, which is fueled by the playful energy of teenagers and can be kind of goofy and cute, as well as sexy and serious. But I want to argue that the forms of recognition, the way in which the lovers acknowledge each other, have the power to shift the conversation in Verona around human worth and personhood. And so that's the kind of where I'm going with this. So we're going to start with what is virtue, and also try to ask the question, is love a virtue? For Aristotle, the essential rhythm of virtue is the movement from potential, which he calls dunamis, and that's the origin of our word dynamic, to actualization, which he called energia, which is the origin of our word for energy. So classical virtue, for Aristotle, for the ancients, and for Shakespeare, is really about actualizing what is potential. And such actualization occurs in relationship to a goal, which Aristotle called a telos, and is also actualized through a particular outcome or activity, a work, a deed, or what he called an ergon. So he had 4 cardinal virtues, and the first of those was courage. And courage really exemplifies this process so beautifully that it's probably what he had in mind when he came up with this schema. What is courage? Well, courage simply means gathering the strength and mustering the will to make or do something that others see and care about, and that others might dislike, reject, or attack you for. That can include reading out loud in class. Elena's going to read for me later today. To hit send on your paper, to say something potentially controversial or unpopular, to text someone you met at a party, to keep your camera on during Zoom. All of these movements, from the potential to the actual, involve courage. If we take the example of reading out loud, the reading out loud is the ergon, the work or deed of the courageous student. And what is her goal? Her goal is to build a participatory community with other students. So, is love a virtue? It's certainly not one of Aristotle's 4 cardinal virtues. This Renaissance emblem identifies love as the cause or root of virtue, as the force which moves us from the potential to the actual, as what encourages us to show up in the world, right? And courage and encouragement are closely related. For St. Paul, love is one of the 3 theological virtues. He says, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3, but the greatest of these is love. However, the word that he uses for love is not eros, which is the Greek word for romantic or sexual love, but agape, which is translated as charity. So it's not love quite in the sense that Romeo and Juliet mean it in this play. However, romantic love in the Christian tradition does have a spiritual dimension. We see this very strongly, for example, in Dante's Divine Comedy. Beatrice is the woman that he loves in a very idealizing way. In fact, she's dead when the poem takes place. The spirit of Beatrice leads Dante on a pilgrimage through heaven or paradise in this beautiful image by Botticelli. And indeed, Dante was the first person to mention a feud between the Montagues and the Capulets. And so the Divine Comedy is actually a distant source for this play. When studying love in Shakespeare, I like to look at 3 things. Love as a game, love as an art of words and gestures, and love as a bid for transcendence, love in its aspirational or teleological quality. So love as a game, how is the search for a partner formalized through games of chance? What are the apps or applications that bring people together who might not otherwise meet? And in Romeo and Juliet, that's the masked ball, right? Romeo comes in a mask, and she's presumably masked as well, and their meeting has a spontaneous quality, despite the highly scripted nature of aristocratic arranged marriages. Love is an art of words and gestures. Do the lovers speak in prose or verse? If they're speaking in verse, is it rhyming or is it blank verse? In Romeo and Juliet, as I think you're learning in class, it's the sonnet as a poem, a game, and a kind of a dance that brings the lovers together. And check and see if I'm right when you're finishing reading the play, but they never ever speak in prose together. It's always poetry, and often it's rhyming. This is a stark contrast from other famous lovers in Shakespeare. Rosalind and Orlando, or Beatrice and Benedict, they largely speak in prose. And then finally, love as a bid for transcendence, as a form of aspiration that reaches within our deep attachment to other people to realize higher goods and imagine new worlds. And this is where dignity will come in to my argument. So poetry rules in Romeo and Juliet. 70% of the play is written in verse, including lots of rhyme. At the beginning of the play, Romeo pens some pretty terrible poems to his first love, Rosalind. Rosalind is his starter muse. But when he meets Juliet, he learns how to craft poetry with her and not just about her. And indeed, their first exchange at the sidelines of the Capulet ball takes the form of a sonnet. And this slide here shows the sonnet form, which you've studied in class, right? We have an A-B rhyme scheme, and it ends with a couplet. And that's very important because it also ends with a kiss. And a kiss is kind of like a couplet, and a couplet is kind of like a kiss, because when two lines rhyme, they come together. They close together like those lips. And through the couplet, the two lovers become a couple. We're going to watch the famous rendition, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Baz Luhrmann film.
I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss.
Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too?
Aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer.
Well then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair.
Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake.
Then move not while my prayer's effect I take.
Oh!
Dave! Oh! Oh!
Thus from my lips by thine my sin is purged.
Then have my lips the sin that they have took?
Sin from my lips? O trespass sweetly urged, give me my sin again.
You kiss by the book.
All right, so as you may have learned when your study of the sonnets, many of the sonnets are structured around a basic conceit or metaphor. And in this case, the metaphor is that Romeo is a pilgrim and Juliet is a saint, right? And so Romeo is comparing himself to a pilgrim, touching the hand of Saint Juliet at her shrine. And this is the palmer's kiss, which is the two palms together. There's a religious aspect of their language that, however playful, already colors and motivates their mutual attraction. In the palmer's kiss, a gesture which is taken, by the way, from social dance. And so everyone at the Capulet ball would be touching palms and exchanging partners. And then Romeo takes her out of the social dance in order to have his own palm dance with her in the special space that they create out of the sonnet. And you can see here that the palmer's kiss is both perfectly lateral, linking them in mutual recognition and reciprocal mirroring, right, composing that sonnet together. And it also points upwards, like praying hands, aspirationally, right, sublimating their love towards a higher order of meaning through the language of worship. And in Baz Luhrmann's film, the lovers compose their sonnet and they consummate their kiss in a glass elevator. And I love that because that elevator brilliantly visualizes both the joy of co-presence and that aspirational surge of the lovers towards a space of transcendental value. And of course, she's dressed as an angel for the costume ball. So what are they aspiring to in and beyond their desire to be together? And to begin answering that question, let's look at the beginning of the play. The play also begins with a sonnet, but it's a sonnet of a rather different kind. It's a character called the chorus who gives a kind of preview of the play to come. And here it can be rendered in many different ways. Sometimes the friar delivers the chorus. In this RSC version, which I like a lot, a group of young actors become the chorus.
Two households.
Both alike in dignity.
In fair Verona, where we lay our seed.
From ancient grudge break to new mutiny,
where civil blood makes civil hands unclean.
From forth the fatal loins of these two foes,
A pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
From forth the fatal loins of these two
Our toil shall strive to mend. Two households, both alike in dignity.
In fair Verona, where we lay our scene.
From ancient grudge break to new mutiny,
where civil blood makes civil hands unclean.
From forth the fatal loins of these two foes,
a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
Whose misadventured piteous overthrows
do with their death bury their parents' strife.
The fearful passage of their death-marked love.
And the continuance of their parents' rage.
Which but their children's end naught could remove.
Is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage.
The which if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend.
I like that. We can maybe talk about it at the end, why that's so effective. So what I want to call your attention to is that the last word of the first line of the play is the word dignity. And so we can circle it as a key word that might be significant for the play as a whole, and then it's a very nice paper writing technique. Test that hypothesis. So that's what I'm going to be doing. All right, so what is dignity? Well, the play starts out from aristocratic dignity, right, involving inherited status and prestige, right? The Capulets and the Montagues are both great houses. They're alike in stature and wealth and antiquity, and that alikeness creates rivalry between them. But there's also another sense of dignity involving the inherent self-worth, the creative capacities, and eventually, although not in Shakespeare's day, the rights-bearing status of all human beings. We can talk about this as inherent dignity, or human dignity, or substantive rather than ascribed dignity. So when I'm looking at a key word, I want to find out, does Shakespeare use it in interesting ways elsewhere in his work? This is another great paper writing technique. So this is from Hamlet. The ghost of Hamlet is telling his son what a great marriage he had with Gertrude. He says, "Oh, Hamlet, what a falling off there was when she married the other guy from me, whose love was of that dignity that it went hand in hand even with the vow I made to her in marriage." So, well, first of all, it's got love and dignity linked, so that's really good for my thesis, right? And King Hamlet is elevating a form of love that belongs to marriage and that goes hand in hand, not unlike the Palmer's kiss. Hand in hand implies reciprocity and consent. It implies the dignity of mutual recognition and respect. Here's an example from The Tempest. And this is Stefano, the drunken sailor, talking about Caliban, the kind of oppressed monster on Prospero's island. And he says, "The poor monster is my subject, and he shall not suffer indignity." Now, demonized throughout the play, Caliban is here granted the possibility of human dignity, even though his humanity itself is always being called into question. And that's the dignity that Caliban will indeed manifest at key moments in the drama. And then finally, this is from Troilus and Cressida, a play about the Trojan War. Here's a little context. Troilus and Hector are, and I'm going to be coming back to the Trojan War, so keep this in mind. This is not just a digression. Troilus and Hector are two Trojans, and they're arguing about whether Helen of Troy is worth fighting for. For Troilus, who has the lines right before these, the war is about the battle for prestige. Dignity is status dignity, pure and simple. So for him, yeah, Helen is absolutely worth fighting for because that's how the Trojans establish and defend their own dignity, their heroic standing. Hector, however, who is the speaker of these lines, and is sort of the courteous great hero of the Trojan side, he argues that dignity is not simply status dignity, it's precious of itself. It can inhere in individuals. And Helen, he says, well, she's given up this inherent dignity through her actions by leaving her husband for Paris. So she is not worthy of this battle. She is not worth fighting for, or dying for, or killing for. So hold some of that in your minds, because we're going to come back to it. But first, let's return to this diagram. So the battle about dignity, the meaning of dignity in the play, is in part a battle between generations. The Montague and Capulet parents are on the one side. They're locked in status dignity, while Romeo and Juliet are finding their way towards something more like human or inherent dignity. But this isn't the whole picture, is it? It's not just the case that young people know more than their parents. Even though Capulet disregards Juliet's desires and threatens to throw her out of the house in the middle of the play, in the party scene, we actually see his virtuous capacity to recognize the dignity of Romeo beyond the feud. Tybalt has caught sight of Romeo, who has entered the festivities masked and uninvited. And Tybalt wants to pick a fight. Capulet, however, restrains him. And Elena is going to come up and read this for us. Exercising courage here. Capulet.
Content thee, gentle coz, let him alone. He bears him like a portly gentleman, and, to say truth, Verona brags of him, to be a virtuous and well-governed youth. I would not, for the wealth of this town, here in my house do him disparagement. Therefore, be patient, take no note of him. It is my will, the which, if thou respect, show a fair presence and put off these frowns, and ill-beseeming semblance for a feast.
Thank you. Beautiful. Okay, so this is a really interesting moment because Capulet is super invested in the feud. But suddenly, here in his own home, he's willing to suspend his animosity and to recognize Romeo's value. So what allows him to do that? Well, I think the answer is hospitality, which in my book, I'm going to start, my first chapter will be called Hospitality, the Mother of All Virtues. In pre-political societies, like the ones depicted in Homer, guests had special rights even when they were enemies. This was called xenia, or guest friendship, or the laws of hospitality, right? It's the root of our word xenophobia, which is the opposite of xenia. Guests, the Greeks argued or reasoned or imagined, guests could be gods or angels in disguise. And that divine character symbolized their dignity and granted them rights of limited protection. A famous example of this is at the end of the Iliad in Book 24, where Greek Achilles entertains Trojan Priam in his tent, even though they are enemies. And Achilles has killed Priam's son Hector and abused the corpse of Hector, and we'll return to this also later in the talk. And Priam comes supplicating to have the body returned. And Achilles extends hospitality to his enemy and restores the dignity of the slaughtered Hector by allowing him to be buried and mourned. Now, Capulet doesn't think Romeo is an angel, but Tybalt here is a bit of a devil, right? But he does recognize that Romeo is a virtuous and well-governed youth, and it's the situation of being host, right, the situation of hospitality that solicits this recognition from the otherwise quite blustering Capulet. Hospitality prompts Capulet's virtuous potential, right, his dunamis, his capacity for virtue, which he actualizes when he quells Tybalt's aggression. So we talked a little bit about the ancient Greeks and their sense of what dignity might be. In the three monotheisms, there is a divine element to human dignity as well, insofar as human dignity is linked to the idea that human beings are created in the image of God. And this is, excuse me, this is the proof text from the book of Genesis. And God created the human, Adamah, in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And this is the translation by Robert Alter, a modern translation. And he actually sets these three lines as verse. Here's what it looks like on the page of his edition. Now, Hebrew poetry doesn't use either rhyme or meter. Instead, it uses parallelism, in which you say the same thing 3 times in different words. And that's how you know that you're reading Hebrew poetry instead of Hebrew prose. So how does parallelism work here? Well, the second line simply repeats the first line back to itself. There's a mirroring relationship, right? God created man in his image. In his image, God created man. I love that, right? The second line is a mirror, which happens all the time, but this is a passage about mirroring, about man coming into being as a mirror image of God. And then finally, the third line introduces a new thought by expanding Adamah, which can be translated as man, earth, humankind, or Adam, into male and female. So there's a primal link here between love, romantic love, erotic love, and dignity, the very link we are pursuing today. Adam and Eve mirror each other, and it's as a mirroring couple, finding their own better selves or souls in the other, that they then mirror God. I love that. I think it's very Shakespearean. Okay, so let's take that back to Romeo and Juliet. So where do we see the language of the Imago Dei, the image of God, in this play? I want to look at the famous exchange at the start of the balcony scene. And note that the exchange takes place in and above the Capulet orchard. So there's a memory of Eden growing in there. And Elena's going to come up again, and she's going to read Juliet's famous lines, which are beautifully symbolized here by the bouquet of roses that Professor Kaufman brought for today's lecture.
"'Tis but thy name that is my enemy. Thou art thyself, though not a Montague. What's a Montague? It is nor hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man. Oh, be some other name. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. Romeo, doff thy name, and for that name, which is no part of thee, take all myself.
Okay, so what's in a name? Although she touches on, even caresses Romeo's first name, is really their family names that set the two houses alike in dignity against each other. And Juliet wants to suspend the power of great families to determine worth in the city by demystifying those status-conferring names. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And what is Romeo's response? Oh, thank you. He says, I take thee at thy word. Right? She doesn't even know that he's down there. But he's so excited, he pops up and says, hey, I take thee at thy word. Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized. Henceforth, I never will be Romeo. Okay, so what is new baptism? Well, he's saying he's willing to change his name for her, so new just means another, a second baptism, which would probably involve his first name. I'll be Arnold instead of Romeo. But he also is suggesting a new form of baptism, right? A baptism in love, a baptism conferred by two persons in relationship to each other. One commentator has called them a new Adam and Eve, whose love recreates the world. To be new baptized in love is to become a new person with and through another human being, and to begin the work of creating a world in which love and dignity can flow more freely. And this new baptism becomes even more powerful, for example, when two men are cast in the main roles, or two women, because the question of human dignity is elevated in these situations. Now, I don't think the lovers are actually thinking about dignity. They are just totally into each other. But I do think that by dropping dignity at the end of the first line of the play, Shakespeare is giving us a tool for tracing the ethical stakes of the tragedy. When Romeo and Juliet freely recognize each other outside the family framework, they begin to transform dignity from inherited status to human worth. And they do this not as philosophers, but as ethical actors, right? Through the way they speak to each other, handle poetic language, and imagine their place in the magnificence of the cosmos. Well, how do things turn out? Not so great, right? And spoiler alert, they are dead at the end of the play, at least in most productions and in the play that Shakespeare wrote. So why does this dignity not flower in Verona? Well, first of all, I think it's too swift, right? After the careful pacing of the sonnet, they gallop apace like wanton horses into each other's arms and beds. And dignity implies a certain tempo, a certain reserve. It's also too private, right? Although they recognize each other as lovers, there is no social recognition. They do not involve their family or friends in the real symbolic work that they have undertaken. They need to find somehow a way to return to that social dance where everybody touches palms and changes partners. And I realize that's a mom's reading of the play. Slow down and keep us in the loop. But finally, and most decisively, Romeo's impulsive decision to avenge the death of Mercutio by killing Tybalt, rather than maintain his fidelity to Juliet, betrays the utopian promise of their new baptism. And this is going to take us back to those Trojans, right? Like the Trojans in Troilus and Cressida, Romeo is caught between the battle for prestige, status, dignity, Troilus, and the inherent worth of Juliet, Hector's argument. And kind of an inspiration for this whole talk is this wonderful essay by the Black classicist Patrice Rankin. And I'm going to be sharing some of his thoughts about dignity in the Iliad. So in the Iliad, which is about the great war between the Greeks and the Trojans, Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes, refuses to fight due to a slight against his honor, his status, dignity. And this is Achilles in his tent with his lover and best friend Patroclus playing music while the rest of the Greeks are slowly losing the war against the Trojans. But then Patroclus decides to go into battle wearing Achilles' shield. And he's killed by Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors. Achilles bandages his lover's wounds, but Patroclus dies in his arms. Furious, Achilles returns to battle, kills Hector, and then drags Hector's body around Troy, refusing to return the body to the family for burial. Now he carries out this brutal action in the name of a certain version of dignity, his horror at the fact that his friend died wearing Achilles' armor, right, dressed as Achilles. But his desecration of Hector's body is a massive assault against dignity. And the crisis isn't resolved until book 24, where we saw the moment of hospitality allowing for the return of the body. So what does this ancient epic story about the defense, destruction, and restoration of dignity have to do with Romeo and Juliet? Well, Romeo, like Achilles, does not want to fight, right? He's absent from the opening brawl because he's writing love poems in the sycamore grove. And later, in the big turning point of Act 3, he doesn't want to fight Tybalt because he's just returned from marrying Tybalt's cousin, Juliet. What happens, though? Well, Mercutio decides to fight. He fights Tybalt and is mortally wounded by him. And he also says that Romeo came between them, right? And trying to stop the fighting, Romeo accidentally causes Mercutio's death, sort of like Patroclus dying while wearing Achilles' armor. So Romeo is in a bind. It's not just that he has to decide between the new dignity represented by Juliet and the old dignity represented by the feud. He also loves Mercutio, who is often represented as gay in the play. And he feels responsible for Mercutio's death. These factors pull him away from his new baptism and back into a form of dignity that becomes a kind of anti-dignity because it now stands in tension with the new dignity of his union with Juliet. Now, Tybalt is no Hector, the archetype of heroic courtesy, and Romeo is no Achilles. Although he kills Tybalt, he does not drag his body through the streets or deny him burial. But I think there is an Achilles-like moment in this play, and that's the killing of Paris at the mouth of the Capulet tomb. This death feels so gratuitous. Indeed, it's often cut completely because Paris, though a little boring, does not deserve to die. And Romeo, our soft boy hero, doesn't need more blood on his hands. Now, Achilles kills Hector twice, once in battle and second by desecrating his body. Romeo kills two men. First, Tybalt, who sort of deserves it, and then Paris, who definitely doesn't. His decision to revert to the old dignity has drawn him further into violence. And it's interesting that it happens in front of the crypt, right? Because the crypt is a place where bodies should be deposited ceremonially with a sense of ritual and community. It's not a place where killing is supposed to occur. Yet the crypt does become the setting for what Shakespeare calls a glooming peace. Here are the parallels I'm drawing, right? Romeo is like Achilles, Mercutio is like Patroclus, And Paris is like the Hector who is killed twice. But what about the moment of returning the body? Romeo is dead, so he can't fulfill that function. And so I think that the Achilles and Priam moment of the play, the moment where dead bodies are given their due and new relationships based on the recognition of mutual loss are formed, is between the two fathers. And so we're going to try reading this together, Eliana. I'm going to be Capulet, and Eliana is going to be Montague and Prince Aeschylus. "Oh, brother Montague, give me thy hand. This is my daughter's jointure, for no more can I demand."
But I can give thee more, for I will ray her a statue in pure gold, that, whiles Verona by that name is known, there shall no figure at such rate be set as that of true and faithful Juliet.
"As rich shall Romeo's by his ladies lie, poor sacrifices of our enmity."
A glooming peace this morning with it brings. The sun for sorrow will not show its head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned and some punished, for never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo.
Thank you. Thank you. So this exchange is often read cynically or ironically as a failed effort at reconciliation. After all, the old guys are still competing, right? And gold is a material thing, far inferior to Shakespeare's eternal verse. Sometimes this part of the play is also cut completely, as it detracts from the beauty of the lover's death. But I think Shakespeare does hold out hope for Verona. As light-reflecting images of two human persons joined in love, the gold statues recall the shrine created by the palmer's kiss. The double image of the two lovers, the imago Dei that they compose together, glows in the glooming peace of the dark morning as a sign of hope. And of course, the two fathers shake hands. This is their own dignified version of the palmer's kiss, aspiring to a civic dignity composed of both forgiveness and justice. Notice that the men speak verse together. It's not technically a sonnet, but it's very, very close to a kind of shared sonnet, a chorus in 3 parts that ends with the play's final couplet and coupling, right? Its final kiss. Shakespeare, as so often in his plays, is thinking with sonnets, rethinking the opening chorus as now a new kind of chorus shared by the 3 men on behalf of the city. And what has made them capable of this reconciliation? I think it's not only their shared grief, but that we also saw in the party scene that Capulet was capable of genuine hospitality. That pre-political virtue becomes the basis of a reformed civic order, with the crypt, the Capulet crypt, as the place where the Montagues are received and recognized. And this crypt becomes equivalent to that tent of Achilles, that place where bodies are honored and returned and their dignity restored. So I think there's a lot to love and to aspire to here, right? Dialogue across differences, acknowledgement of our shared humanity, the free exercise of hospitality, and a commitment to becoming a more just society through public art and public poetry, including the dramatic poetry embodied by theater. So that's what I have, and we'll take some questions. You were very patient. I know there was a lot in there. And I think we're using the microphone for questions. And there's a question in the Peter, our philosopher.
I was just thinking through the kind of parallels that you were elucidating between these two senses of love and two senses of dignity.
Yes.
And I haven't been able to wrap my head around, although I wonder if there's a way to think about two senses of hospitality that also correspond. Let me just try to say what I'm getting at. So the two senses of love that I thought I saw were, one is the sort of emotional or romantic love. This is like maybe that feeling, like when you see somebody and you're just overwhelmed with that sense of like they're glowing and you're drawn to them. It's like almost a force that pulls you. And you mentioned that this can be a motive to virtue. But then there's a different maybe sense of love, perhaps coming from somebody like St. Paul, or that we find in other kinds of religious texts. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant talks about this as, he would describe it as practical love, and he says this emotional form of love cannot be commanded. I can't just tell you, I can't just choose to feel a particular way. I can't turn it on and off. But what I can do, and perhaps this is what is meant when the command to love thy neighbor as thyself is issued, what I can do is something like recognize the value of that other person, to take their good as my own good, to recognize the value of their values. And so that recognition is something I can choose. That's a choice I can make. I can adopt this telos or this end, and I can pursue it. That first form of love, the romantic kind, I think doesn't necessarily lead to virtue. That strong pull, that sense of emotion can lead us to obsession or possessiveness, which is contradictory perhaps to dignity, because it's to see a person as an object rather than as a person. And so then there's maybe two senses of dignity. There's the kind of dignity that's about status, and protecting that kind of dignity can lead me to all kinds of evil. I don't know that seeking that form of dignity is necessarily a virtue. I mean, I think in the ancient Greek epics as well, right? Honor is due to power, not to goodness. So that kind of dignity that's about power, I don't know that I think much of that. But then there's this other kind of dignity, this inherent dignity or human dignity, which is something like the value of the person, recognizing that this person is important. They have standing. They are in some sense equal, like the Palmer's kiss, right? There's a recognition of equal humanity. And so I just thought it was really interesting, those twin parallels of the kind of romantic love versus, I'll call it practical love, and status dignity versus human dignity, and the way that the practical love and human dignity strike me as, I think, clear kinds of virtues, and the former, which we also call love and dignity, don't strike me as particular virtues. And I wonder, first, if I'm seeing what you're putting down, and second, if there is a way to think about hospitality as also having these kinds of, does that parallel continue into hospitality? Sorry, that was a lot. I apologize.
That was great. I'm glad this is being recorded because I can transcribe it afterwards. Yeah, that, of course, Kant is the gold standard for thinking about human dignity. I think he called it Würde, which is sort of worth. It's this cognate of our English word worth. And so like the dignity scholarship, this is a great book, this Dignity, a History, which the essay on the Iliad is from. And it's kind of looking at the prehistory of the Kantian idea and then the afterlife of the Kantian idea. But Kant is really the turning point of the story about dignity and also respect. And it seems that word respect shows up in Romeo and Juliet as well in that opening chorus. Or no, actually in Capulet's speech to Tybalt, I noticed when Elena was reading it. So Kant is very, I'm trying not to be Kantian because I'm writing about Shakespeare, but Kant Kant drives the discussion on dignity. And so that's very, very relevant. And I didn't know about Kant on practical love. So that's a nice missing piece for me to bring these things together. And I think Shakespeare, is interested in tempering romantic love with practical love. And less in Romeo and Juliet, but that also their love is tragic. But if you look at, As You Like It, the relationship between Rosalind and Orlando, like Orlando opens that play very much as a Romeo type. He's writing bad poetry. He's infatuated with Rosalind, but he doesn't really know who she is. And that's why she insists on speaking prose to him, because the poetry is getting him into trouble. And she knows, and she's dressed as a boy, so he doesn't know that he's actually getting to meet her. But she has to educate him in the realities of married love in order to make him marriageable. And so I think this is a very important Shakespearean question. I think we see versions of this in Antony and Cleopatra. We see versions of this in Much Ado About Nothing, and even possibly in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's relationship, although that's, of course, its own special set of questions. So I love the idea of practical love. And I think Shakespeare, I cut a slide that's a kind of ruler of all the different kinds of love in the play. And romantic love is in the center as a kind of balance between a purely Platonic Dante and Beatrice kind of love and a purely sexual or irrational love. You know, for the ancient Greeks, love was pretty scary. It was demonic. And it wasn't until quite a bit after Aristotle that you have romantic love being narratized in ways that would resonate with us. Yeah, anyway, that's a great question. And then for hospitality, I think there's an imbalance between the host and the guest. So yes, the guest is offered, it has certain protections, but they have protections because they're so vulnerable. And the host can, so it's from a position of power over the guest that the host tolerates the guest, right? And so we see that in the Capulet scene, right? He tolerates Romeo rather than letting Tybalt beat him up. And that he can do that because he's in a position of control in the household. So hospitality also does have this power basis to it. And of course, the other great thinker, Kant was also a great thinker of hospitality and the idea of migrants having certain rights and so forth. So all roads lead to Kant eventually. Hi, Chris.
Hi. I also was interested in the idea of hospitality here. I think in the ancient world, the rules of Xenia are like very clear, and I think you see that really clearly in the Iliad and the Odyssey. You see Achilles being rewarded for following those rules with Priam and is seen as dignified and respectable afterwards, whereas Odysseus is, throughout the entire Odyssey, punished for his breaking of those codes, both in Troy, bringing in the Trojan horse, and then punishing people who have broken those codes in his own home. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how Shakespeare sees that. Does he also believe in this punishment for breaking codes of dignity, either in hospitality specifically, but in all of these areas that you're questioning?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Macbeth would be the great example of that, right? Because Duncan is a guest in Macbeth's home. The king comes as a guest, and although the king is in power as king, he relinquishes that power by taking on the vulnerability of the guest, and Macbeth chooses to kill him while he's sleeping, which is not what great warriors do, right? I mean, in the Iliad, you have the great battles between, Hector and Achilles, and they're on the battlefield and they're face to face. You don't kill someone in their sleep as a guest in your house. So Macbeth is really the prime example of the kind of crimes against the laws of hospitality. Whereas Capulet is really trying to uphold the laws of hospitality in that important party scene. So that's a great question. Thank you. I have a question for you, which is that second clip that I showed from the Royal Shakespeare Company of the chorus. What did you think of that? Do you think that was? I mean, the directors have all these decisions to make. When you're reading it on the page, you don't hear it that way in your head, right? So what do you think the director was trying to achieve, if you remember it?
when he's, or the director, whoever it is, with everyone talking or like the same time, you know, I think he's trying to outline the chaos that's going on throughout the entire scene.
Beautiful, right. So it's all the young people. Usually the chorus is an older guy like the friar or Aeschylus, the prince, you know, someone who's kind of in charge of the city. But this director put the chorus in the hands of the young people. And by having them talk over themselves, we have the sense of chaos of the brawl that's going to happen, you know, a few minutes later in the opening scene. And then the couplet, which is actually delivered by the character playing Mercutio, who is played as a kind of lesbian trans figure by an actor. And so the Mercutio gives the couplet because Mercutio is such an important figure in that turning point. So what I love about theater is how much storytelling you can do without changing any of the words and establishing the kind of, this is going to be a youth production, this is going to be a multicultural production, this is going to be a production that acknowledges queer lives. You can do all that just by how you stage the first 14 lines of the play. And so it's fun. Another nice paper topic or paper writing technique is to compare 3 different ways in which directors have opened these plays. You only have to see the whole production. Right? Just how do they get the thing started? What is the ethos? What is the atmosphere? What is the rhythm that the director is getting? Because they put a lot of time into that. I help with our Swan Festival at UCI each summer, and we put so much time into how the plays open. What's the music? What's the lighting? Who's speaking? Is there a dumb show? Or, you know, how can we get all the actors on stage in that first 2 minutes so that people get a preview of what's coming? And so that's another great technique for if you're interested in how theater works, to really compare those openings.
And I think also the director, as well as Shakespeare, with his words, we're trying to outline the confusion throughout the play. Like, for example, Mercutio still thinking Romeo loves Rosaline, and also at the end of the play when Romeo sees Juliet dead, quote unquote dead, and kills himself. So yeah, I think it outlines the confusion that each character experiences as they're talking at the same time. They're like, what's going on? Everyone looks confused, you know.
That's great. And there's a wonderful phrase in one of his Rosalind passages early in the play. There's something like form in chaos. And that's it's a nice description of the creative process. It's a nice description of how the play works. Like, how do you generate form from chaos while also representing the chaos? And how do you then resolve that in some kind of glooming peace at the end? So that's great.
Oh, is it working? Okay, Gabriel.
I was gonna say, I think sometimes in theater, the concept of like the ensemble or the chorus comes out and like looks up and everyone has something to say can sometimes be a little overdone. So it's really important, I think, when the director chooses to stage that moment. Because when you do have a moment where the entire chorus or ensemble comes out, it can be a moment that's really poignant and really gets the points across about your play. And you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to every 2 seconds have everybody comes on, everyone has something to say. But I think with a play like Romeo and Juliet, it works because for the rest of the play, it's usually just characters talking to each other one-on-one or in smaller groups. You don't usually get it where it's like all of Verona is there. But by staging it where it's just this first scene of everybody and everyone coming out, it kind of shows the impact that just these 2 characters and their very personal story will have on a larger group of people. Because for the rest of the play, you don't usually, besides maybe like the ball, you don't get to see all of Verona all in one spot. You don't really get the scale of how large this story actually is. It kind of just seems like a story about 2 teenagers, but I think setting it that way at the beginning, it really shows just the large scale that this story will have on the rest of the people there.
Oh, that's beautiful. And yeah, directors have to decide, am I telling a private story about 2 lovers? and their families, or am I telling a broader social story? And I think that particular director is clearly interested in the broader social story. And they dramatize that by opening with that chorus. Whereas when the other time when all of Verona appears is at the very end in the crypt scene, right? You've got dead Tybalt, dead Paris, dead Mercutio, usually, even though he's not really a Capulet. And then, there's surviving parents and all, everybody's there, either dead or alive. And a lot of directors don't want all those characters on stage. So like the Romeo and Juliet ballet usually just ends with the two lovers dying in each other's arms. You don't want to then have a big finale, a big group dance, But you're losing, I don't want to say there's anything wrong with that, but you're making decisions about what is the meaning of the play. And clearly if I think the play is about this search for human dignity in a social space. So I want all those characters, as long as we don't lose the romantic through line, which is what, is our reward. We can think deeply about these important social issues, but the romance is still what keeps us in our seats and returns us after intermission.
And, yes, please, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that for me, I'm more into the traditional style of it. For me, it's the melancholy, it's the sadness, it's the tragedy, and that intro held none of that for me. So I probably would have walked out of the theater.
Right, well,
because it's not sharing your intimate relationship.
Right.
When I read that whole first chorus, what it says to me is this is a sad situation that's not just the kid's fault, it's everybody's fault.
Right.
And from that intro, I didn't get any of that.
Right, that's why having the friar deliver it can be very effective, right? Because the friar is a kind of failed mentor figure who has insight into what happens because he's helping orchestrate it. There was a wonderful ballet that I saw a couple of years ago from, I think, the Royal Ballet of Monaco, which really made it the friar's story. That the friar is narrating all of this in his head and remembering what happened. And so you can kind of choose your point of view when you're directing. There's so much, it's just so amazing what theater can do.
Yes, Ryan, go ahead.
Do we have any idea when Shakespeare and his team, I suppose, performed the play, what exactly did they do?
Well, there certainly would have been dancing. There would have been music. The musicians were up in the gallery space above the stage. It would have been, of course, live. There was no recorded music. So the music was live. There was minimal sets, but they put a lot of money into costumes, which were, of course, reused from production to production. But the costumes were the most valuable asset besides the building itself for the theater. And so they did a lot with costumes to establish the mood and the themes of the drama. And they wouldn't have changed those costumes much. We'll do a Western Romeo and Juliet, or, they would have really nice 16th century costumes. And even if it took place in, the medieval period, they would still be wearing those 16th century costumes. They might have some Greek costumes a little bit, but largely they're using beautiful clothing of the day. Beyond that, obviously this is the play text that we have. Romeo and Juliet does survive in a couple of versions, a quarto and a folio. So we know it was performed. We know it was performed pretty frequently, that it was popular. Shakespeare keeps imitating it in his later works. So it's, even though it's a kind of early, not as complex as some of his other works, it's clearly a key moment in his creative activity that generates a lot of thought as he matures and goes more towards that pragmatic love. He has Romeo and Juliet, as part of his kind of compositional infrastructure, if you will. Looks
you
like there's
so-
one more question
Oh,
here, and that's maybe the last one.
One more. I just want to be
Oh.
aware of the time as well, just because students may have
I
class
know,
after.
Yes, this will be our last one.
Please, Evan, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say that was a great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
But my question is, you said Shakespeare portrays love as a game, partially.
Yes.
Could you expand on what you mean by that and give more examples?
Yeah, so it's like marriage was very structured. You know, even in the countryside, marriages were, largely arranged by parents. And yet, people were also falling in love and sometimes marrying despite what their parents wanted. And they also had to meet each other, even if there was a lot of parental supervision in the final decision-making. There were moments in the calendar, moments in life in which the segregation of the sexes and the supervision by older people was suspended. And so we see that in Midsummer Night's Dream. It's the celebration of May Day. The young people are going out into the forest to collect hawthorn branches for the May Day celebration. And we know historically that a lot of young women became pregnant on May Day and ended up being married a little bit later to the young man that they met out in the forest. So that's an example. And As You Like It, we have the wrestling scene. So the young people are present and they're watching wrestling, and Orlando wrestles, and Rosalind rewards him, with her token. And so that's a kind of a game as well. And here it's the masked ball, in which you introduce anonymity and chance into the highly structured aristocratic marriage market, let's call it, that we see between Paris and Capulet, for example. And then Valentine's Day, that they had like lotteries. They had some kind of game of chance, a little bit like our Valentine's Day cards that we exchange like in grade school. But there was some kind of, I don't remember all the details, but there was like a game of chance, or like spinning the bottle. Like you don't know. And you might not like that person, but if you hadn't spun the bottle towards them, you wouldn't be able to test whether you liked them or not. So there was this introduction within regulation and a very rule-bound approach to courtship. There were these elements of chance and surprise. And Shakespeare likes those because those are drama, right? It's chance and surprise.
Thank you so much. Let's have a round of applause for Professor Lupton. Thank you so much. It was such an amazing presentation. I think we all took away so much from that talk, and to think of dignity and a new version that perhaps Shakespeare is outlining with the future, and maybe redeeming the fathers a little bit. I had never thought of that, and which is nice to have, because they're what remains at the end. And thank you all so much for coming here, for our students, for our staff, for our faculty, for your wonderful questions. We have lunch set out for you outside. You're welcome to grab something and go if you have another class or work, or just hang around a little bit and ask a few more questions. We have a few mementos of thank you from the School of Humanities.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.